Kate Webster was born in 1849 as Catherine Lawler in the picturesque town of Killane in County Wexford, South West Ireland. From an early age, Kate was a constant source of trouble for her respectable, struggling parents, and despite their best efforts, her behaviour remained unchanged, prompting her family to seek help from the local priest. Her behaviour didn't change, and over the years Kate committed numerous thefts that would eventually lead to her incarceration at the age of 15. After leaving prison, she continued to steal until she could afford a boat ticket to Liverpool in 1867. Not much is known of Kate's early life or what she did when arriving in Liverpool. We do know she spent most of that time in and out of prison, mostly on charges of theft. Usually from landladies who had rooms to let, she would allegedly take items from the house while the landlady was distracted. We also know that she started using the name Webster around this time, which was just one of her many aliases she used. Kate had stated that she had married a sea captain and had 4 children, all of whom had unfortunately perished. However, it is widely believed that this claim, like many others made by Kate, was simply a fabrication, as she had gained a reputation of being a highly skilled and frequent liar. After a sentence of 4 years penal servitude in Liverpool for larceny, she decided to head to London in 1872. Within a year she had relocated to Hammersmith in West London, where she found herself living in a neighbourhood known as Rose Garden. During her time there, she struck up a close friendship with the Porter family, who happened to be her next-door neighbours. Interestingly, they initially mistook her for an unemployed servant. She continued with her life of crime, teaming up and living with a man who she later claimed seduced her. Having fallen pregnant, she gave birth to a boy in April 1874 at Acre Road in Kingston. It was while here she was constantly visited by a man named Strong, who was allegedly her partner in crime. It was also largely believed by the locals that he was the father of her child. But who knows, as he was just one of the 3 men she would claim had fathered her son. She would later claim that having been forced out of her home and moved into a cottage on London Street, she had been forced to steal to provide food for her son, as the father had forsaken them. But it's also been claimed that she was involved with a gang of thieves and the police were hot on her heels, so she left before she could be caught. While at the cottage, she was introduced to a woman named Sarah Creese, who would later help her look after her son while she was presumably in service. Kate moved around London using all her aliases, renting rooms from unsuspecting landlords before selling everything of value from the rooms and leaving. Eventually, in May 1875, while living in Teddington, she was caught and convicted of 36 charges of larceny at Surrey Sessions on the 4th of May. She was sentenced to 18 months in Wandsworth Prison. Within months of her release, she was arrested again for felony and sentenced to another 12 months in 1877. When Kate was released, this time she moved in with a man she called Mr. Mitchell, who she also claimed to be the father of her son. While living there, she started an affair with the 20-ish-year-old son of her friend Sarah Creese. George, a potman at the King's Hotel in Twickenham, was visited by Kate on a regular basis, so much so that his employees had to stop the visits as it interfered with George's work. A defiant George would end up being dismissed. It was said that George and Kate were often seen at a beer house called the New Inn, where they sat for hours talking. After the affair with George had ended, some time went by before Kate made an appearance at his mother Sarah's residence in Richmond in January 1879. Sarah graciously allowed Kate and her son to reside with her. While Kate was there, Sarah, a charwoman for a Mrs. Lodder, became ill and asked Kate to fill in for her. Miss Lodder, Sarah Creese's employer, had a friend, Julia Martha Thomas, an older widow who lived alone and was desperately looking for domestic help. Miss Lodder put Kate Webster's name forward, as the temporary work she had provided her seemed fine. Julia Martha Thomas, a 55-year-old former schoolteacher, had experienced the loss of both her husbands and was left with limited financial resources. While she was not wealthy, there were rumours suggesting that she strived to project an upper-class image beyond her true means. Her neighbours thought her slightly eccentric and a little excitable, with claims that she could be difficult to work for because of her eccentricities. She seemed to live a relatively quiet life and enjoyed travelling. She would, according to her friends, disappear for weeks, sometimes months. She could be fastidious with her home and said to be tactless with how she spoke to others. This was disputed by some, as it was also stated that she often offered work to those less fortunate in the hope that they would go on to live a better life, and they claimed she didn't seem to be the sort to vex others. The two-storey semi-detached house, number 2 Mayfield, Allvine Cottages, in Richmond, London, sits in a reasonably quiet area with pretty little front and rear gardens. It wouldn't be classed as quiet, as it was located next door to a pub called the Hole in the Wall. On January the 29th, 1879, Kate Webster visited Mrs. Thomas at her home and briefly discussed her duties. Without inquiring about Webster's previous employment or background, Mrs. Thomas immediately hired her. Kate, on returning to Sarah Crease's home, told her she found Mrs. Thomas to be a nice, good-hearted lady. Unfortunately, they clashed from the start. Mrs. Thomas didn't approve of Webster's trips to the pub, but more so Webster's lack of attention to her work. Mrs. Thomas considered Webster to be lazy and continuously criticised her work. As a result, Webster's resentment towards Mrs. Thomas grew. The tension between them escalated, culminating in Mrs. Thomas giving her notice, with a proposed last day of February the 28th. The last note in Mrs. Thomas's diary read, "Gave Catherine warning to leave." Webster managed to persuade Mrs. Thomas to extend her departure by 3 days. On Sunday the 2nd of March, Webster's last day, Mrs. Thomas had arranged with her that she should help her prepare for her evening service at the local Presbyterian church. As it was Sunday, Webster had the afternoon off. She would usually visit her son, who was staying with Sarah Crease, but on this Sunday she spent some time at the pub with her friends. She returned to the house late, where a very angry Mrs. Thomas waited for her. A heated argument ensued, and Mrs. Thomas left. The church congregation reported later that she seemed agitated and apologised for her lateness, as her servant had delayed her. She went on to tell them Kate had flown into a terrible passion. But what happened that night is purely down to Webster's confessions, as Webster made 5 statements. The absolute truth must be in there somewhere. In her first statement, made on March the 30th and April the 1st, 1879, she tried to lay the blame on John Church, someone she'd known for a few years, claiming he had entered the home to steal items belonging to Mrs. Thomas. A fight had ensued, where he pushed Mrs. Thomas down the stairs. Everything that happened after that was down to Church's orders. In her second statement, made on April the 10th, she laid the blame on Henry Porter and Church. Her third statement was given on July the 10th, where she admitted to making false statements and that Church and Porter were innocent of the murder. She now claimed that her Mr. X, who was also the father of her son, had turned up at Mrs. Thomas's house while she was out, with another man to steal the silver. Mrs. Thomas returned unexpectedly, and the 2 men had done something to her mistress. In her fourth statement, she continued with the man she called X, adding a woman into the mix this time, who left the house with a carpet bag. She then claimed X and the other man had been targeting the houses to break into. She claimed X had advised her not to be at the house on that Sunday, as they had targeted it. On July the 28th, Webster made her fifth and final statement. When realising her former claims hadn't been successful and she was still going to the gallows, her solicitor advised her to tell the absolute truth. In her statement, she declares that in the sight of the Almighty God, she needed to clear those of suspicion she had mentioned in her previous statement. She finally told how she, Webster, had pushed Mrs. Thomas down the stairs after another heated argument. In Webster's own words, Mrs. Thomas came in and went upstairs. I went up after her and we had an argument, which ripened into a quarrel. And in the height of my anger and rage, I threw her from the top of the stairs to the ground floor. She had a heavy fall, and I became agitated at what had occurred. I lost all control of myself, and to prevent her screaming and getting me into trouble, I caught her by the throat, and in the struggle she was choked, and I threw her on the floor. Webster's actions after this is very disturbing. To quote her confession, I chopped the head from the body with the assistance of a razor, which I used to cut through the flesh afterwards, said Webster in her confession. I also used the meat saw and the carving knife to cut the body up with. She continued, I prepared the laundry copper with water to boil the body, to prevent identity, and as soon as I had succeeded in cutting it up, I placed it in the copper and boiled it. I opened the stomach with a carving knife and burned up as much of the parts as I could. It was also reported that Webster had visited the pub while she waited for the body to boil. Webster then put the body pieces, except the head and a foot, because they didn't fit, into a wooden box, and the head into a Gladstone bag. 2 days after the murder, Webster took the Gladstone bag containing some of the body parts and visited her old friends, the Porters, in Hammersmith. It was the first time she'd seen them in 6 years. On arriving, she claimed she was married to Mr. Thomas, who had died, and her aunt, who had passed, had left her a house in Richmond. The Porters didn't question this, as she was dressed in Mrs. Thomas's fine clothes. She went on to claim she was headed to Scotland as her family wanted her to sell the Richmond house and everything in it and be close to them. Webster went on to ask Mr. Porter Sr. if he could find someone who would buy the furniture and if young Robert Porter could accompany her back to Richmond to help her. On the way to the station, Robert carried the Gladstone bag that, unknown to him, had contained the body parts. He carried it to the station, but he found it heavy and struggled to keep up with her and his father, who had walked with them. They made a brief stop at the Oxford and Cambridge Arms for a drink. While there, she claimed the bag contained a gift for someone she had arranged to meet. After telling the porter she would be back shortly, she left with the bag. When she returned, the bag was gone, and I don't think it was ever found. Robert Porter and Webster then went on to Richmond. At the cottage, she gave Robert a heavy box to carry, telling him it contained meat and vegetables for a friend who she was meeting at Richmond Bridge. The box was heavy, and Robert struggled to carry it when he and Webster set off. As they reached Richmond Bridge, they stopped to rest. Webster claimed to have forgotten something at the house and asked Robert to go back and get it. He set off back to the cottage, but the young Robert got scared walking in the dark and hid for a short time in a recess. While there, he heard a splash before Webster ran up to him, claiming she had given the box to a friend. The box was discovered around the 5th of March, washed up on the banks of the River Thames. At the time, the body couldn't be identified or linked to Mrs. Thomas, as she hadn't yet been reported as missing. The foot was found not long after on a rubbish heap in Twickenham. It was obvious it was part of the remains found in the box, but the identity was still unknown. The unknown remains were buried in Barnes Cemetery. Although unidentified, the story of the remains had already started garnering the interest of the public, the media having already dubbed the murder the Barnes mystery. Meanwhile, back in Richmond, an annoyed Robert found that the last train to Hammersmith had gone, and he had no choice but to stay at the cottage with Webster. Robert returned home the next day, and Webster turned up at the Porters later that day and supposedly stayed the night. She would go on to stay the weekend at the Porters after Mr. Porter Sr. had been to the cottage on the Saturday to value the furniture she was selling. On March the 9th, Mr. John Church welcomed Webster and the Porters at his pub The Rising Sun to discuss the sale of items from Vine Cottage. They arranged to meet at the cottage so he could inspect the furniture. On March the 11th, Church visited the cottage and joined Webster for some food and drinks. Before that, Church had examined the furniture and agreed to a deposit of £18. On Tuesday the 18th of March, Church and Porter started to load some of the furniture when a neighbour, Mrs. Ives, saw what was happening. Curious, she went to talk with the two men. Church informed her they were moving the furniture to Hammersmith. When asked who had allowed this, he told her it was Mrs. Thomas, and the move was halted. Mrs. Ives confronted Webster, asking where Mrs. Thomas was, to which she replied she didn't know. Mrs. Ives made it known that she would inquire further into the missing Mrs. Thomas's whereabouts. Webster panicked, knowing she needed to leave as soon as possible. She grabbed as much as she could and used the money she had from the deposit. She sat in the Rising Sun drinking. Before departing, she borrowed money from Mrs. Church. Webster collected her son and left for Liverpool, where she boarded a coal boat to Ireland. On arriving in Killane, Webster went to stay with her uncle, Mr. Lawless. Meanwhile, Mr. John Carter started to suspect something was amiss when he couldn't locate Webster to retrieve the furniture he had reserved with a deposit. Mrs. Carter, his wife, stumbled upon a dress that Webster had included among the belongings her husband had gathered and discovered some items tucked away in the pocket. One of these items was a letter addressed to a Mr. Menhennick. They went to this address and asked him about Mrs. Thomas. It was here they discovered that Kate Webster wasn't Mrs. Thomas at all. A worried Mr. Menhennick wrote to Mrs. Thomas's solicitor, Mr. Hughes, telling him of what had happened. The Churches and the Porters were interviewed by Mr. Hughes's brother, and after telling him all they knew, they went to inform the police. Inspector Pearman, who was on duty that day, Saturday the 22nd, went with the group to Vine Cottage and inspected the property, but didn't find anything. The next day the inspector questioned Robert Porter, who had told him of the incident on Richmond Bridge on the 4th of March. Things started to take shape for the police when Robert identified the box the remains were found in. On Monday the 24th, the police went back to Vine Cottage, where they found the knives and some bones. On the 25th, they find Mrs. Thomas's diary at the cottage. A further search of the property the next day comes up with traces of fatty substances and bloodstains. Kate Webster, who had a previous criminal record, was widely known to the police, and her description was circulated throughout the UK. It didn't take long for them to locate her at her uncle's residence in Killane. Following her arrest on the 28th of March, she was taken to Enniscorthy Jail, where she faced charges of wilful murder and theft. Webster talked constantly on the journey back to Richmond, and it's at this time she first mentioned John Church. Her claims that he was involved sounded plausible to the police, and this statement is classed as part of her first one. John Church was arrested on the 30th of March. On the 31st, Webster and Church were brought before the magistrates. The proceedings were delayed until the 9th of April. When it continued, all Church's witnesses were brought to give evidence. Fortunately, Church had solid alibis, as did Porter when she amended her statement accusing him of being involved. Kate was committed to trial on May the 16th. Church and Porter would later be vindicated of any involvement in the death of Mrs. Thomas. On the 2nd of July 1879, the trial of Kate Webster began. The Old Bailey buzzed with anticipation, with many prominent people in attendance and a large crowd outside the court. Solicitor General Sir Hardinge Giffard led the prosecution. London barrister Warner Slay, a highly respected defence lawyer, defended Webster, and the case was presided over by Mr Justice Denman. Webster pleaded not guilty, and over the next 6 days a number of witnesses were brought in. A bonnet maker in Birmingham claimed Webster had visited a week before the murder and claimed that she would be selling property and jewellery. This was important as it indicated premeditation of murder. The witnesses obviously included the Porters and Mr Church, who Webster had accused of doing the murder. Her defence fought with the circumstantial evidence, saying that she was devoted to her son and wouldn't do that to him. However, her unpopularity with the public, her lack of showing any emotion, and meagre defence went against her. The jury took an hour to deliberate, and on returning they gave a guilty verdict. When Webster was asked why the sentence of death shouldn't be passed, she shockingly responded that she was pregnant. This would send the court into turmoil. It was eventually agreed to send in a jury of matrons, this being 12 sworn women and a bond doctor, to attend to Mrs Webster and clarify if she was with child. Within minutes they returned and testified she was not, and Kate was sentenced to death. An appeal was put forward on her behalf, but refused. At 9 a.m. on the 29th of July, Kate Webster stood in the courtyard of Wandsworth Prison. The words of the Catholic priest reading the service hung in the air. As he reached the part, "Jesus, Good Shepherd, come," Kate cried out, "Lord, have mercy upon me," and the bolt was pulled. The crowd erupted with cheers as they hoisted the black flag above the prison walls, a clear sign that the hanging had concluded. Just like countless others before her, she was laid to rest in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds. Due to the severity of her crime, Webster's poor son was rejected from his uncle's home and sent to a workhouse when he was just 6 years old. Later he was transferred to an industrial school for impoverished children. Unfortunately, there is no further information available about him after that. In 2010, while excavating an old pub next to his cottage, the world-renowned naturalist Sir David Attenborough discovered a skull buried in his garden. This marked the long-awaited discovery of Julia Martha Thomas's skull, over 100 years after it had been buried. Thanks for listening.